In 1973, the world economy changed. The warning signs had been there, but no one really wanted to notice. Inflation and mass immigration returned to Australia after being absent for decades. Both had existed in small measures, but now they became dominant features of the economy. Inflation was brought under control, but unemployment became permanent. It has never left since the early 1970s. You would think that good policy would say that as unemployment was high, immigration should stop or at least be curtailed. While for a time it was curtailed, but it never stopped. And by the late 1970s, it was bigger than it had been. The big change in the period between 1970 and 2000 was that now immigration from Asia and Muslim countries grew strongly. What had been small populations of a few thousand grew into the hundreds of thousands. In 1989, after the Tiananmen Square massacre in China, the Australian government granted nearly 200,000 Chinese citizens in Australia at that time permanent residence overnight. It should be pointed out, not all stayed, and it was popular at the time, but it gives a measure of the Australian government's commitment to immigration. In the year 2000, immigration became a very controversial issue in Australia because of boats arriving from Indonesia with illegal refugees or asylum seekers. The people were not Indonesians, but mostly from the Middle East. The Australian people have always been outraged by those who arrive without the government's permission, by extension, the people's approval. It brought into disrepute Australia's entire refugee policy. If refugees can decide for themselves, why should we as a nation have a policy that admits them, was the question the majority of Australians asked. There was a very vocal minority that said this was simply racism and that Australia was a wealthy country and that we should in effect have a policy of open borders. Immigration, or at least refugee immigration, was controversial, even in Parliament. The issue is unsettled. It remains highly controversial, with the most extreme views being expressed on both sides of the often public debate. Australia today has nearly 1 in 3 of its population having been born overseas. In 100 years, we have gone from 98% of the population being British to 66%, with no end in sight. In the West, only Luxembourg has a higher immigrant population than Australia. If things continue as they have, White Australians will be as much a memory as the White Australia policy itself.